the tension we're feeling in the use of the Gospels, any Gospel, and certainly the Gospel of Mark in the life of the church. And one of those tensions is that we have a narrative in the Gospel itself. And it is, at least in the approach I'm using here, a fairly self-contained narrative from the beginning of the Gospel to chapter 16. But we also have a context for the Gospels in worship that is in many ways liturgical. And from my point of view, and I think from the point of view of those of us in our tradition, both of those contexts need to be honored. And that is a bit of a tricky thing, I think, because of the way we divide up the gospel text in the lectionary. Sometimes we're not even, the gospel text is not even from the gospel chosen for that year, in this case, Mark. So we're trying to balance two things. And Pastor Randy communicated with me this week and wanted to know a little bit more about how we might do such things as manage both of those contexts when we think about, in this case, the Gospel of Mark. Now, I don't know that I have any particular wisdom about that, but I have some thoughts. And one of the thoughts is that at the beginning of the new church year in Advent, or shortly thereafter, as we're doing this year in the case of Mark, it's a good idea for all those who are interested to spend some time thinking about the larger architecture of the gospel for the year, in this case, Mark. And we think about how those individual texts, those individual pericopes, fit into a larger context in the gospel itself. Because a whole lot of work on the gospels has been done from the point of view of seeing them as narratives. And that's the approach I'm taking to Mark. That helps us perhaps during the year to have a sense of how these individual gospel texts fit into this architecture. The second thing that I think is the case, and I think our pastors at St. Andrew and Northridge do a quite good job of this, trying to see the individual text for the day, assuming the sermon is on that gospel text, in the course of the sermon, taking a bit of time to situate it in its literary context in the gospel as well as trying to situate it in the liturgical context for the day. Now, I don't know, Randy, if you have additional thoughts, you're certainly welcome to throw them in, or anybody else for that matter. But I do think both of those things have to be kept in play in our tradition, and that's rather important as we try to think about Mark as a literary text, as a narrative, as a story with its own character, and at the same time as we try to do this in the context of our liturgical life. So, something to think about, something to be aware of. Now, I'm going to make what I think is a kind of a bold statement for this kind of non-bold person, perhaps, and that is that if you were to ask me for the most succinct and provocative statement about what the Christian life is about, I would be inclined to point to the Gospel of Mark. It's succinct in the sense that it's shortest of the Gospels, but in some ways, and I hinted at this last time, I think it may be the most provocative. Now, if you read the statement, the description of this course, again, that we introduced last time, in a sense, that's my best shot at giving you a synopsis of the Gospel of Mark. And when I if you were to read that article that's posted of mine, you would see that at the end of that article, I reiterate something that is fundamentally important about the Gospel of Mark. It's a narrative theology in words, but it's a narrative theology in action as well, as represented by Christ, as represented by the disciples. And so when we talk about a narrative theology, it's not simply words, but as we will see today, it's an invitation to join the journey, which begins in chapter 1. Now, there are a lot of texts in the New Testament that I think are highly descriptive and provocative and quite succinct in some cases, having to do with the Christian life, Christian faith, the community, and so on. I will also say that if we think about the Gospel of Mark and we follow it through from chapter 1 to 16, and we understand that architecture, and here I speak for myself, but I suspect I speak for many others, in some ways, the gospel is a bit too hot to handle. It is cutting, it's provocative, and again, a bit too hot to handle. Now, what are we going to do about this? I think there are 3 levels that I like to use when I'm thinking about how we work with this. Now, I preface this by saying my 3-fold list is a bit wooden, and it never happens this woodenly. But I think the Gospel of Mark gives us a kind of overarching vision for that narrative theology of Christian word and action. And we ought never lose sight of that too hot to handle vision. But we also need to do a couple of other things. Second of all, to call upon theologians, theological ethicists, to reflect on that vision in our own contemporary context, whatever those contemporary contexts might look like or be. And that's why we have a small cadre of folks who devote special attention to trying to work out some of the implications of that vision, both theologically and ethically in our contemporary context. And the third level is what the practicing preacher does. Day in and day out, week in and week out, as that vision, as those theological and ethical thoughts end up being proclaimed to the faithful who come and gather in worship, face to face or virtually or however it may happen. Now, again, I emphasize that kind of 3-leveled way of thinking of it, I think has some educational value, but it usually happens much more dynamically than in that wooden way of doing it. I think the vision in Mark's gospel is very important, but some of the things make me cringe, and I wonder what might happen if we actually implemented in a literalistic sense some of them. So the theologians, ethicists, and the pastors have this incredibly important task of trying to work out implications in the context, the contemporary context. So if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to raise your hand. I'm more than willing to have you enter in. I don't want to do all the talking. But some of you know me well enough to know that if you want to see if I can talk straight for an hour, I can do it. And it might be better if I didn't, but I can. I am able. Today, as I had indicated, we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 1, verses 1 to 434. And if we, let me see if I have this here. If you come back to, I'm not sure what I'm sharing here. I maybe not. Okay. If we go to, I don't know where I am now, cancel that. It's not showing up anyway. If we think about that Sandra Hubenthal outline, which I gave you or posted, this first third that we're going to look at really is only a part of her design, but her outline covers too much for one session. So if we take those 4 or so chapters from the beginning of Mark, we can divide those 4 chapters into 3 parts, I think, as well. The first one is simply the beginning of the gospel. It runs from chapter 1, verse 1 to verse 15 of chapter 1. The second one begins in 1:16 and runs to chapter 3, verse 35, and then chapter 4, verses 1 through 34. And I'm going to work from the New Revised Standard Text here. If you have your text with you, it would be good for you to open it at this point and take a look. We all know that the beginning of Mark's gospel does not contain a birth account. It begins with an assertion that alerts us to the identity of the main character in the story, the beginning of the gospel or good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then there is a quotation, ostensibly, as the text says, from the prophet Isaiah. And it launches immediately into John the Baptist and the baptismal scene. And we all get a sense here that the pace of the story is moving very, very quickly. In fact, there's a Greek word, euthos, which is translated into the English as immediately, immediately, immediately. Now, that's not just a repetition of a word, but the narrative itself is proceeding very rapidly. And we get to verse 9 in chapter 1. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending like a dove on him. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." There are several things in that short text that I think are significant. First of all, the English, in a sense, tempers this. The heavens torn apart. The Greek word, schizamenos, is from the root of the English word, or schizophrenic, split mind, literally ripped in two, and then the Spirit descends on him, and we have an assertion about who Jesus is, the beloved Son. 3 times in the Gospel of Mark. Once here, once virtually in the middle of the narrative at the Transfiguration, and then in a very unusual way at the end of the Gospel, Jesus is identified as the Son. The only difference at the end is he is identified as Son of God by a Roman centurion. The other 2, he's identified as by a voice from heaven. Verse 12, chapter 1, and immediately the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. Again, if you looked at the Greek word, he's literally thrown out into the wilderness. ekbalo, thrown out. And Jesus came to, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts and the angels. And the angels waited upon him. Happens very quickly. But the story is often running, and probably in verses 14 and 15, you get a kind of marquee headline for the entire narrative that's going to follow. Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God, literally, or we might translate the reign of God, has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. If you want to know, I think, kind of the headline of the whole story, that's it. Now, from this point on, we're going to begin what is commonly called in Markan studies the journey, which is the organizing structure for the rest of the gospel. And that journey is going to take many different twists and turns, and we're going to see how it begins in verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left and followed him, and he went a little further and saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. Immediately, he called them. They left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Now, we could turn this around. How do you think their father felt about this? They don't ask any questions. They just hop to and go. I don't think I would have been, when our three daughters were younger, if they just hop to and follow some guy around. I don't think I'd have been too thrilled about that. From the point of view of the four fishermen who are called, they don't seem to ask any questions about this either. They just hop to and follow. The journey has begun. The four followers don't know where they're going. They don't know what the implications of this following might mean. They simply go. We're going to discover a little later on in the story that this gets really complicated for them, as you, I'm sure, already know. And the disciples are going to be more fearful than they are faithful at many points in the narrative. And as we will see, and this is simply anticipatory, but as we will see, it's hard to see the disciples in Mark as stalwart models of what discipleship and following Christ is all about. Verse 21, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this, a new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Have any of you been to Capernaum? Anybody? I'm going to see if I can share a picture here. I don't know that I can, but let me, maybe I can't. I'm going to try to share a picture here with you. Can you see that? Okay. If we were in Capernaum today, or Capharnaum, the village of Nahum, if we were there, this is what we would see. Now, the ruins are from well after the time of Jesus. This is a synagogue. But you also see some stones here that have been removed, and some archaeologists have drilled down below the current stonework to see if they could find ruins underneath. And there's a little bit of evidence that there was a previous synagogue that this structure built over. Now, there are some oddities in this text. When we enter into the story world of Mark, certain things work together in a way that, at least in the world that I really live in, are not the case. He teaches, and the people around are astounded at his teaching, and he teaches as one who has authority, but not like the scribes. And then there's this exorcism. And he exorcises the demon, be silent, come out of him, and the unclean spirit, convulsing him, cries with a loud voice, and came out of him. And they were all amazed. It appears as though Jesus' teaching and its authority is confirmed by the exorcism. I used to say to students, on the first day of class, I walked in and I tried to perform an exorcism on somebody. And then after that was over, I'd say, okay, now you can see I'm teaching with authority, and you ought to accept or believe or subscribe to everything I teach. And I remind them that the first thing they would probably do is, after class, walk over to the registrar and check out. We don't necessarily, at least I'll speak for myself, I don't necessarily think that doing some miraculous deed confirms the authority of every word I attempt to teach. But that's the way it's portrayed here in this narrative world. And insofar as we enter into that narrative world, we observe something. Jesus, the beloved Son, has authority over the things of the spirit world. And interestingly, the things of God and the things of Satan recognize each other. Later on, we'll see the disciples may not really recognize who Jesus truly is, but the spirit world seems to. And the journey has begun, and then he turns around and very quickly leaves the synagogue and enters into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. They told him about her at once. I suspect she didn't have COVID, but she was sick. Now, if I can share a screen with you again, let's just try to go, turn around. I took that first picture facing one direction, and I turn around, and this is what you see. The ruins of the village of ancient Capernaum. Now, let me see here. And over what is thought historically to be, or at least ritually to be, the house where Simon's mother-in-law lies ill, a kind of flying saucer church has been built by the Franciscans over that site. I make a distinction here. There is a difference between historical sites often and those that have come to be ritually pilgrimage sites commemorating the great events of Jesus' life. Okay. Skipping on, I'm going to skip on a little bit here for the sake of time. In chapter 2, verses 1 and following, you see there are some intervening episodes here. Jesus heals a leper. And at the beginning of chapter 2, he returns to Capernaum. And after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around him that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? Is it blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to him, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, 'I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home.' And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, 'We have never seen anything like this.'" Okay. Something fundamental in this text seems to be at stake. Who is Jesus? If he's an imposter, then the charge of blasphemy is exactly right. But if he is of God, the charge of blasphemy is incorrect. Clearly, as the story is told, the narrator and the storyteller and the story itself wants us to conclude something about Jesus, who he is, his identity, and he clearly is not an imposter. The charge of blasphemy, says the Markan narrative, is not correct. It is unjustified. Jesus is not a blasphemer. But you notice something else here that I think, as a contemporary 20th or 21st century person, makes me a little uneasy. The connection between physical infirmity and sin. More than a little uneasy. I don't think, make that exactly that kind of connection. And if our pastors went to the hospital bedside of somebody suffering from a disease, illness, condition, I don't think they would somehow relate sin directly to that situation. That could be a kind of tyrannizing sort of thing. And shortly after all of that, we come to chapter 2, verse 15. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. He's already got an entourage, and we're only a few verses, lines into this narrative. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." We're getting our real first glimpse here, I think, that this reign of God, this kingdom of God, as the text literally describes it, is a bit more edgy and provocative than we had thought. It is a powerful image of the open table to which those who are on the margins of society or disrespected by society are invited to participate in one of the most intimate of human activities, eating together. Now, I don't know about you, but during this pandemic time, Julie and I enjoy eating together, but we really miss having guests at our table, being a guest at somebody else's table, going out to eat, going out with others to eat, and engage in that most intimate of human, one of the most intimate of human activities, sharing a common table. In this case, that open table is for those who are on the margins. That gives us an early glimpse of the kingdom that Mark is portraying. Now, we can say, oh, sure, we affirm that. But often we like to have at our common table people who are kind of like us. If we move on fairly quickly here.
Jim, I unmuted myself.
Okay, yes, Diane.
In that period of time, who would, when they says tax collectors and sinners, who would have been considered the sinners?
Yeah. Well, good question. Just step back for a second here. For those of you, we don't normally lump IRS agents into this category today. The tax collectors would have been lumped. But in some cases, you see, collecting taxes was a problematic thing because they were collecting taxes from oppressors in many cases, and they were engaging in a way or a method of collecting taxes that has sometimes been referred to as tax farming. You collect what your overseer wants, and you collect whatever additionally you can, and you can keep that. Well, imagine, I don't know if anybody here works for the IRS, but imagine if the IRS agents went out and knew what the federal government or the state government needed or wanted, was entitled to, and then tried to collect more. That would be a system just ripe for graft, obviously. So tax collectors are in a category that is really sinners. It's not quite so clear, Diane, who might be included, but I think we can infer from the text certain things. They're people who are not the respectable, upstanding folks. They may engage in activities that are considered inappropriate or contrary to the religious practices or more common morality, and on and on. We know more broadly from the New Testament, of course, there are varieties of people who are not looked upon favorably in the social order. And I think the term here sort of lumps all of them together. Unless, do you have any further thoughts, Diane?
No, it's such a broad category. And
right.
And of course, in our context, we are all sinners and saints. And so I just have trouble with
I think that's worth it. In here, because my primary New Testament interest is Paul, I guess, but we often make distinctions, as Paul did. I don't know that I see this in Mark, but between sin, capital S, in typical language, the condition of being in sin, from which we cannot extricate ourselves, and then sin or sins, small s, actions that are considered to be sins. Paul has a lot to say about the first, somewhat less to say about the second. But I'm not sure Mark is making those kinds of distinctions here. Anybody else comment? Yeah, Peggy? I'll unmute you here.
Oh, him. Okay.
Augustine.
Okay, you're
Founding him.
Okay.
okay.
I understood that tax collectors were not paid, and that was part of the reason that they got into that, and that probably personality-wise they were into that kind of wheeling and dealing, but that they had the job. Go ahead.
It could be, Peggy. Yeah.
And so they collected a little extra because that was their pay, essentially. That's what they lived on. And that made that nobody wanted to associate with them. And so anybody that was associating with them would be looked down upon by everybody else, and probably people that were unliked for some other reason, maybe, groups like that get together. I was thinking back to the days when I was a kid. I can't remember exactly, but before I was 13, because of the house we lived in, where this was in Nebraska, and the tax assessor came around and looked at your stuff. They looked at your house, decided what your taxes would be. And my mother would take things that, or have us take things that she thought were valuable and take them up to the attic. Like she had a tray with a teapot and a silver thing and the teapot and sugar and so on. And I remember that always got carried up and stuck in the attic. Because people didn't want to give the impression that they were wealthy, that they had a lot more than they had. And also the attitude toward the guy who was the assessor was pretty negative. I mean, it was like,
Yeah.
He was
It-
not your friend.
yeah. Well, I think I don't know much about taxation, but I think most states, if not all states, have removed personal property from taxation.
I think that's true, but I'm just saying
In the former days, yeah.
the assessor was unpopular person.
Yeah. Well, you know, the notion of taxation gets to be identified with a person, I suppose. But again, you know, for our purposes here, the point is basically that Jesus sits down with these people, and Levi is the one who, in a sense, is represented here in that. And you see that now the entourage has just been enlarged by a tax collector, not looked upon favorably, and Jesus again opens the way for that. Now, again, maybe I have a little agenda anxiety. We're going to move on to chapter 3, where this entourage is enlarged even further in chapter 3, verses 13 and following, when the full complement of disciples, Jesus goes up on a mountain and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. And then the names are listed and so on. And when we look down to verse 20 in chapter 3, then he went home, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, he's gone out of his mind. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, he has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of demons, he casts out demons. Literally, in the Greek text, he's out of his mind could be translated literally, he's standing by himself. He's beside himself, out of his mind. There is a reaction on the part of those who see this, his family, and he is an embarrassment and needs to be restrained. Now, just a little further on in that same chapter, we're going to see this provocative text in chapter 3:31 and following. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And he replied, who are my mother and brothers? And looking at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. Now, you could read this, I suppose, and just see it as an ungrateful son who doesn't want to have anything to do with his family. I don't think that's really what's going on here. I think what's going on here is that this Markan text is redefining the nature of the community that follows Jesus. It's not based on lineage. It is based on doing the will of God, and whoever, regardless of lineage, regardless of anything else, we might say ethnicity, nationality, anything else, is the one who does the will of God and is part of this family. We don't probably think that this is quite so provocative, but it differentiates this early community to which Mark is writing, let's say roughly around 70. In a sense, it redefines it relative to Judaism, and it redefines it relative to other religious entities in the ancient Mediterranean world as well. And as it plays itself out in the history of Christianity, you see the church ultimately as a more global phenomenon based on other criteria of entrance than lineage. And I think you can see that being hinted at here already at the end of chapter 3. It's not really that Jesus is an ungrateful son or sibling, but Mark is making a broader claim. Now, one can imagine in the earliest period of the church and those among those who follow Jesus that it had a disruptive effect on certain families. That's probably not so surprising, but it's affirming those who do the will of God. Now, chapter 4. It's one of my favorite chapters in the whole of the book of Mark. It's his chapter on parables. And I'm going to move quickly here, but chapter 4, verse 1. And he began to teach beside the sea. Chapter 4, verse 1. Such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there while the whole crowd was beside the sea and the land. He began to teach them many things in parables, Greek parabole. And in his teaching, he said to them, listen, a sower went out to sow. Okay? A sower went out to sow. And we have the parable of the sower. Different kinds of seed, different kinds of soil types, etc. And, you know, it really doesn't take a particularly perceptive reader of this to get the gist of what the parable is about on one level. And then, if you skip down to chapter 4, verse 13, he gives an explanation. And he said to them, do you not understand the parable? If you read this quickly, you may miss one of the significant features of this text. The parable at the beginning of the chapter apparently is told to the whole crowd, a large crowd of people, some of whom are not on the journey with him. Just a large crowd, you know. And as he gives the parable of, teaches the parable of the sower, it's not all that. It's not all that complicated on one level to figure out. But notice verse 10. Chapter 4, verse 10. When he was alone, those who were around him, along with the 12, asked him about the parables. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret, literally in Greek, the mystery of the kingdom of God, the reign of God. But for those outside, everything comes in parables. Just pause there for a moment. A distinction is being made here between those who are on the journey and those who are not. Oh, well, let's put it this way, be more precise. I should say those who are on the journey, the 12 and a few others, and then more broadly to that group, but a larger group. And then he's alone with those who are on the journey with him. And he says, those who are around with the 12 asked about the parables, and he said to them, to you has been given the mysteries of the kingdom. But to everybody else, it comes in parables. Now, I don't know, I don't remember exactly when I first started to learn about parables and so on and so forth. I don't, maybe it was in confirmation class, maybe it was in Sunday school. But I always thought parables were teaching devices. I'm not sure they are for Mark. Because notice in verse 12, the parable, everything comes in parables to those who are outside, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven. Okay, we're going to have a, we're going to be cut off here before too long, but keep in mind, many interpreters of Mark say that the word parable here is closer to a riddle than it is a teaching device. I would even go so far as to say that for everybody outside, everything comes in riddles, confusing statements. Perhaps the goal of the text is to remind people that the riddles separate insiders who have been given special instruction from those who are on the outside.
So,
Now,
so
I
Jim,
might say,
Jim, got a question. Where's my hand?
yes, Randy, I've got a, let me,
How is it, is Mark is talking in riddles, how is this good news?
well, that is a really important question. How could this be good news? Now, just as, we may have to pick this up next time and pursue this a little further, but in the Revised Standard Version, the translation read at verse 12, and he said to them, verse 12, everything comes in parables so that they may indeed look but not perceive. It's a result clause. It comes in parables or riddles